The courtroom door slammed shut and the air turned thick with silence, broken only by the sharp gasp of 100 onlookers. Officer Daniel Hargrove, badge gleaming under the fluorescent glare, stood frozen, his hand still gripping the arm of the woman he'd just dragged in, cuffs dangling from his belt. He thought he'd won until her calm, piercing gaze met his, and the truth hit like a freight train. She wasn't just any defendant, she was Judge Amara Ellis, the youngest black woman ever appointed to the federal bench. Hargrove's heart pounded as the room spun. He'd stormed into the courthouse, fueled by a tip about a suspicious black woman loitering near the judge's chambers, and now his mistake was unraveling in front of a packed gallery. Amara's judicial robe, slightly askew from the scuffle, hung as a silent rebuke to his rash judgment. Her voice, steady but laced with fire, cut through the murmurs, "Officer, you will release me. Now." The crowd held its breath, and Hargrove's face drained of color. He'd just manhandled a judge in her own courtroom, and the weight of his error was suffocating. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a collision of worlds. Hargrove's entrenched biases crashing against Amara's hard-earned authority. The incident, now spiraling into a public spectacle, began hours earlier in the quiet streets of Fairmont, a small town where racial tension simmered beneath polite smiles. Hargrove, a 20-year veteran of the Fairmont Police Department, prided himself on keeping order. To him, order meant control, and control meant quick judgments too often based on skin color. Amara, born and raised in Fairmont's struggling West Side, had clawed her way through law school and a legal career to become a symbol of hope for her community. Their paths crossing today wasn't chance, it was a reckoning. The morning had started routinely for Amara. She'd arrived early at the courthouse, her usual habit, to review cases. Dressed casually in a hoodie and jeans before changing into her robe, she'd stepped outside for a quick coffee run. That's when Hargrove, patrolling nearby, got the call, a suspicious individual, near the courthouse. The description was vague: female, black, mid-30s, but to Hargrove, it was enough. He spotted Amara, her hoodie up against the autumn chill, and his instincts kicked in. To him, she didn't look like a judge. She looked like trouble. "Ma'am, stop right there," he'd barked, striding toward her. Amara turned, surprised but composed. "Can I help you, officer?" she asked, her tone calm but firm. Hargrove ignored the question, his hand already on his radio, calling for backup. "ID, now." Amara's eyes narrowed, but she reached for her purse slowly, deliberately. "I'm Judge Amara Ellis," she said, offering her court ID. Hargrove glanced at it, scoffed, and tossed it back. "Nice try. You're coming with me." The next few minutes were a blur of escalating tension. Amara, refusing to be cowed, demanded to know the charge. Hargrove, his voice rising, accused her of trespassing and resisting. Passers-by stopped, phones out, recording the scene. By the time Hargrove marched her into the courthouse, still gripping her arm, the situation had spiraled. He didn't know couldn't have known that the woman he was hauling in was the very judge presiding over his precinct's latest misconduct case. Inside the courtroom, the truth dawned slowly, then all at once. The bailiff, recognizing Amara, shouted, "Officer, that's Judge Ellis." The crowd erupted in gasps and whispers. Hargrove's grip loosened, his face a mask of panic. Amara straightened, brushing off her sleeve, her eyes never leaving his. "You assumed I didn't belong here," she said, her voice low but carrying the weight of the room. "Why is that, Officer Hargrove?" The question hung like a guillotine. Hargrove stammered, his usual bravado crumbling. He'd built his career on snap judgments, on the unspoken belief that people like Amara didn't belong in places of power. Now, that belief was unraveling in real time, broadcast to a courtroom full of witnesses and soon, to the world, as phones kept recording. Amara's rise to the bench hadn't been easy. Growing up in Fairmont's West Side, she'd seen the system's flaws up close, neighbors harassed by police, friends denied opportunities, her own family dismissed as less than by those in power. Yet she'd fought for every inch of her success, earning a scholarship to Howard University, then a law degree from Yale. At 35, she was a trailblazer, appointed to the federal bench to bring fairness to a town where justice often felt like a privilege, not a right. But to Hargrove, she was just another face to profile, another threat to contain. The courtroom standoff wasn't just about them. It was a microcosm of Fairmont's divides: racial, economic, and cultural. The crowd, a mix of black and white residents, reflected the town's uneasy balance. Some saw Hargrove as a hero, a cop doing his job in a world they viewed as increasingly lawless. Others saw Amara as a beacon, proof that their community could rise above systemic barriers. The tension between these views crackled in the air, threatening to ignite. As Hargrove stood, speechless, Amara took control. She stepped behind the bench, her robe now fully straightened, and banged her gavel. "This court is in session," she declared, her voice steady despite the chaos. The room quieted, but the weight of the moment lingered. She looked at Hargrove, still frozen in the aisle. "Officer, you will take a seat. We have much to discuss." What followed was a hearing unlike any Fairmont had seen. Amara didn't just preside, she turned the incident into a public reckoning. She called Hargrove to the stand, not as a defendant but as a witness to his own actions. "Explain," she said simply, her tone leaving no room for evasion. Hargrove, sweating under the courtroom lights, fumbled through his reasoning, the vague tip, the hoodie, the suspicious behavior. Each word dug him deeper, exposing the assumptions he'd never questioned. The crowd leaned in, some nodding in agreement, others shaking their heads in disgust. Amara listened, her face unreadable, but her questions were surgical. "Did you verify the tip before acting?" she asked. "Did you consider that I might belong here?" Hargrove's answers grew weaker, his confidence eroding. The room felt like a pressure cooker, every word a spark that could set it off. Outside, the story was spreading. Phones in the courtroom had captured everything, and clips were already hitting social media. "Cop drags black judge into court" trended, igniting debates across Fairmont and beyond. Some called Hargrove a victim of a misunderstanding, others labeled him a symbol of systemic racism. Amara, meanwhile, became an unwilling icon, her face splashed across X posts and news feeds. The pressure was immense, but she refused to let it derail her. Back in the courtroom, Amara shifted focus. She called community members to speak, residents who'd faced similar profiling, who'd been judged by their appearance rather than their character. Their stories poured out: a teacher stopped for looking out of place, a teenager cuffed for walking home late, a nurse questioned for sitting in her own car. Each testimony built on the last, painting a picture of a town where trust between police and community had frayed to breaking. Hargrove sat, head bowed, as the stories unfolded. For the first time, he was forced to listen not as an officer, but as a man. Amara didn't lecture, she let the voices speak. But her presence behind the bench, unwavering despite the morning's humiliation, was a statement in itself. She was the embodiment of resilience, a black woman who'd risen above a system designed to hold her back. As the hearing stretched into hours, something shifted. Hargrove, still on the stand, began to speak, not to defend himself, but to confess. "I didn't think," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I saw you, and I just assumed." The admission hung heavy, raw, and unpolished. It wasn't an apology, not yet, but it was a crack in the wall he'd built around his worldview. Amara leaned forward, her eyes locked on his. "Assumptions have consequences, officer," she said. "They break trust. They destroy lives. What will you do about it?" The question wasn't just for Hargrove, it was for everyone in the room, everyone watching online, everyone in Fairmont. The courtroom, once a battleground, was becoming a space for something else, something harder, messier, but necessary. The hearing didn't resolve everything. Hargrove wasn't fired, nor was he absolved. Amara didn't demand his badge, she demanded accountability. She ordered him to undergo bias training and community service, not as punishment but as a chance to rebuild what he'd broken. Justice isn't revenge, she said, addressing the crowd. It's repair. As the gavel fell, the room exhaled. Some cheered, others grumbled, but all felt the weight of what had happened. Amara stepped down from the bench, her robe flowing like a shield, and walked past Hargrove without a glance. He watched her go, his face a mix of shame and something new, maybe the first stirrings of understanding. The courthouse doors swung open, and Amara Ellis stepped into the crisp evening air, her judicial robe replaced by the same hoodie that had sparked the day's chaos. The crowd outside buzzed, some holding signs demanding justice, others shouting in defense of Hargrove, their voices clashing like waves against a jagged shore. Amara's face remained composed, but her heart raced. The weight of the day off being manhandled, misjudged, and thrust into the spotlight pressed against her, yet she stood taller for it. This wasn't just her fight, it was Fairmont's, and she wasn't done. Inside, Daniel Hargrove lingered in the now empty courtroom, his badge heavy in his pocket. The hearing had stripped him bare, not of his job but of the certainty he'd carried for 2 decades. Amara's question, "What will you do about it?" echoed in his mind, relentless. He'd always seen himself as the good guy, the one keeping Fairmont safe. But the stories he'd heard today, raw and unfiltered, painted a different picture, a town where his version of safety often meant fear for others. He slumped into a chair, staring at the wooden gavel on the bench, its etched words, "Justice tested in fire," burning into his thoughts. The fallout was immediate. By nightfall, the story had exploded online, with X posts racking up millions of views. Clips of Hargrove dragging Amara into the courtroom looped endlessly, each share fueling heated debates. Some called him a racist, demanding his badge, others argued he was just doing his job, caught in a bad call. Amara, meanwhile, was hailed as a hero by some, a troublemaker by others. Fairmont's fragile unity cracked further, with neighbors turning on neighbors, each side digging into their version of the truth. Amara didn't check her phone. She didn't need to. The notifications, supportive, hateful, and everything in between, would be there waiting. Instead, she drove to the west side, to the small community center where she'd once attended after-school programs as a kid. The center was packed, not with protesters but with locals, black, white, young, old, drawn together by the day's events. They weren't here to shout, they were here to talk, to grapple with what had happened. Amara slipped in quietly, taking a seat in the back. The room hummed with tension, but also with something else, a hunger for change. A teacher spoke first, her voice shaking as she recounted being profiled by police years ago. A young man, barely 20, shared how he'd stopped walking to the store at night, tired of being stopped. An older white woman, her hands trembling, admitted she'd never questioned the police until today. "I thought they were always right," she said, her voice breaking. "I was wrong." Amara listened, her heart swelling and aching at once. This was why she'd fought for the bench, not just to judge cases, but to create space for moments like this. When it was her turn to speak, she stood, her hoodie a quiet nod to the morning's ordeal. "Today wasn't about me," she said, her voice steady but warm. "It was about us. About what we let slide, what we excuse, and what we demand from each other. We can't fix Fairmont overnight, but we can start tonight." Her words struck a chord. The room didn't erupt in cheers, it fell into a thoughtful silence, the kind that precedes action. Amara didn't offer easy answers. She didn't absolve Hargrove or demonize him. Instead, she challenged the room to think, what does justice look like to you? Not just for me, but for all of us. The question lingered, sparking murmurs, nods, and a few tears. Across town, Hargrove was facing his own reckoning. He'd gone home, expecting to drown his shame in silence, but his wife, Sarah, wouldn't let him. A nurse who'd worked the West Side clinics for years, she'd seen the community's struggles up close. "You messed up, Dan," she said, her voice firm but not cruel. "You didn't just grab a judge. You grabbed a person. And you didn't see her. Hargrove wanted to argue, to defend his instincts, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he sat, head in his hands, as Sarah pushed a laptop toward him. "Watch it," she said, pulling up the courtroom videos. Reluctantly, he did. The footage was brutal, not in violence, but in clarity. There he was, storming in, his face twisted with certainty, dragging Amara like a criminal. Her composure, her strength, stood in stark contrast. For the first time, Hargrove saw himself as others did, not a hero, but a man who'd let bias blind him. The realization wasn't instant redemption, it was a gut punch, the kind that forces you to rebuild from the ground up. The next morning, Fairmont woke to a town transformed. The courthouse incident had ignited protests, but also dialogues. Community groups sprang up, some led by Amara's allies, others by residents who'd never spoken out before. The police chief, under pressure, announced a review of profiling complaints, with Amara's input requested. She agreed, not because she trusted the system fully, but because she believed in shaping it from within. Hargrove, meanwhile, began his mandated bias training. He went in skeptical, expecting a lecture, but found something else: real stories, data, and hard questions. The trainer, a retired black officer, didn't coddle him. "You're not a monster," she told him. "But you're not innocent either. What you do next matters." Hargrove didn't have answers yet, but he was starting to ask the right questions. He volunteered at the West Side Community Center, not as a cop but as a neighbor, helping with youth programs. It was awkward, met with wary glances, but he showed up anyway. Amara, too, faced her own challenges. The spotlight brought pressure, death threats from anonymous cowards, but also invitations to speak, to lead, to represent. She accepted some, declined others, always returning to her courtroom. There, she presided with the same fairness she'd always shown, but now with a deeper resolve. Her rulings, once seen as strict, were now understood as rooted in a vision of justice that included everyone. Months passed, and Fairmont didn't heal overnight. Protests flared, then faded, replaced by town halls where voices clashed but also listened. Hargrove and Amara never became friends, but they crossed paths again at a community forum. He approached her, hesitant, and offered a quiet, "I'm sorry." It wasn't polished, but it was real. Amara nodded, her eyes searching his. "Keep showing up," she said. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a door left open. The town began to change, slowly. Police training shifted, with community input shaping new policies. The West Side saw more investment, not just in money but in attention, people showing up, listening, building. Amara's courtroom became a beacon, a place where justice wasn't just administered but lived. Hargrove, though never fully redeemed, became a reluctant advocate, speaking to other officers about his mistakes, his voice raw but honest. On the anniversary of the incident, the community center unveiled a mural, a black woman in a judge's robe, standing tall, with a crowd behind her, diverse, united, imperfect. Below it, carved into a wooden plaque, were the words, "Justice tested in fire." Amara stood before it, tears in her eyes, not for herself but for Fairmont. The town wasn't perfect, but it was trying. And that, she knew, was where hope lived. The story of Amara and Hargrove didn't end with a neat bow. It ended with a challenge, to keep talking, to keep questioning, to keep building. What's right, what's wrong, what's justice? Share your thoughts, because Fairmont's story and ours isn't finished.